cities, tore down our best neighborhoods, and forced us to be nomads in our own country. We'd be imprisoned in our cars, separated from our loved ones by great distances, and made to watch helplessly as our farms and forests were laid waste by bulldozers and backhoes. Why, there'd be a revolution. Isn't that right?
Right.
Funding for this program was provided by the Heinz Endowments, Wyomissing Foundation, Chester County Community Foundation, Susquehanna Pfaltzgraff Company, Montgomery County Lands Trust, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation.
When my mom is here visiting, she just can't get over the amount of time that I spend in a car. You plan your life around the schedules and the drives and where you're going.
You look around on the ground today, you see broken bottles, you see leaves, you see trash. You know, drugs on our corner. People who are not working, it's like they don't care.
You see this house in the middle of a field and you think, why? You know, there's developments. Why must you wreck a whole farm?
There's no large area of open space left in this entire area. I can't think of one. Now it's just house after house, and you know, pavement after pavement, stretching into pavement.
And you start, when you're going through the orthodontist, you start, you know, will a 4 o'clock appointment be fine, Mrs. Whitlatch? Well, no, not a 4 o'clock appointment coming down Fruitville Pike. Are you nuts?
The people that have moved in here like us to keep the farms open so that they can snowmobile or hunt, but we're not supposed to be on the road when they want to go to work.
You don't see the grandmothers today because they are hostage in their own homes. They're afraid to come out. It's like we don't have control of our communities today.
I'm Tom Hilton, and this is my house of 27 years, 222 Chestnut Street, Pottstown, Pennsylvania. From the front door of my house, this is what I see, a parking lot. Beneath that asphalt lies the thread connecting all the stories you just heard. When my wife and I moved here back in 1973, I was starting out as a reporter for the local newspaper, The Mercury, and my wife got a job teaching at the local elementary school. This house was perfect for us. The paper where I worked was just a block away, and my wife's school was just a 15-minute walk. And across the street, on the side of that parking lot, was a beautiful old high school, which had been converted into a middle school. I loved the sounds of the kids milling outside in the morning. I liked listening to the music wafting out the auditorium doors on warm days, thinking of all the kids who had gone there over the years, the thousands of powerful memories that were born there, right across from my house. It broke my heart when they tore it down. Declining enrollments, they said. Now it's just rubble under here, and my neighborhood's never been the same. What really outraged me was, even as the wrecking ball swung, the suburban school district just outside of town was building a new middle school at a cost of millions of dollars on what had been farmland, skyrocketing enrollments just a couple of miles away. And it wasn't just Pottstown, it was all over America. My whole life I'd been seeing wonderful towns being torn down, bit by bit, while we covered the countryside with strip malls and subdivisions. I couldn't understand why we were doing this, why it had to be this way. So I started to study it and write editorials about it to figure it all out. It's been a long journey, which is what this program is about. But one thing I knew even then, when they tore down my neighborhood school, they weren't just tearing down a building. They were tearing down heritage, community, stability, everything that's precious about a traditional town like Pottstown. My love for traditional towns began here, Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, where I was born. A town of big trees and cozy streets. I joined our first 4th of July parade when I was 1 year old. 50 years later, it's still going strong. Wyomissing has become a pretty exclusive place, but it began as a factory town. My mother moved here as a toddler in 1918 when the town was just starting to take form.
We were the second family to move there, but in about a year, all the houses were sold, and I had plenty of playmates.
Wyomissing was started by two German industrialists, Henry Janssen and Ferdinand Thun, to be the home of their Berkshire knitting mills, at one time the largest manufacturer of women's hosiery in the world. Janssen and Thun didn't think a mill town had to be dirty, noisy, and unpleasant. They hired the foremost town planner of their day, John Nolan, who laid out Wyomissing with tree-lined streets and parks and schools. Wyomissing had all the elements of society in less than 1 square mile. Our little row house was just 3 blocks from the mansions of Janssen and Thun and just 2 blocks from the Berkshire.
We walked to school, and we would, pick up people as we went along, and we'd get to school in a great big group. It was a very nice way. And then we came home at noon. Daddy came home for lunch, and my mother had the meal ready on the table 12:15, and we had lunch, and we didn't have to hurry, and then we got back to school by 1 o'clock.
My father died at a young age, and my family, in reduced financial circumstances, moved to an apartment in nearby Reading, a city of 100,000 people. Like other American cities at that time, Reading was perfectly safe. I walked to all my friends' houses, I walked to school, where I had a wide range of friends, from the son of a janitor to the daughter of a neurosurgeon. There were adults in my life, too. At least once a week, I would walk to my grandmother's apartment on North 10th Street. I'd run errands for her here at the corner store, usually have at least 12 cents left over for a tasty cake. In the mornings, on the way to school, I'd admire all the beautiful big houses on Center Avenue. I never felt poor, even though we didn't have much money. I fully expected that someday I'd own a big house like one of these. But 35 years later, Reading's changed. My old elementary school is now a mini-mart. The factories are vacant. The downtown stores are gone. The theaters I frequented on Saturday afternoons are parking lots. The neighborhoods have declined, and the crime rate is among the highest in Pennsylvania. But no city fell as far, as fast as Philadelphia. This is the Germantown section of Philadelphia. In the 1950s, it was one of the most fashionable neighborhoods in Pennsylvania. Then, in the 1960s, like scores of other Philadelphia neighborhoods, it started to go downhill.
My wife, who lived in Nicetown, walked to Germantown Shelton, which was about a 6 to 8 block walk.
Civic leader Joe Egan grew up in the working-class neighborhood of Hunting Park.
If you look at 6th Street here, right now where we're coming up to, you had grocery stores, you had taverns, you had bakeries, everything was here. And you could walk there easily. I could walk in this air any time of night, any time of day, absolutely safe. And any section in this neighborhood, any time during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. You could walk to school, you could walk to your cleaner, you could walk to your baker. It had a scale about it. It made it very easy to live here. In addition to that, the housing was very inexpensive and nice, straight through, good quality stock. Even today, even with all the deterioration, there's housing stock in this area is absolutely beautiful. You no longer have the jobs here anymore because the industry that was here in the 30s, 40s, and 50s is gone. It's either in South or it's offshore completely. And when you saw, Apex or Keebler or SKF, and you saw those losses of major industries, you could see the economics leave the neighborhood, and then that led to the physical deterioration. I think one of the issues too, the wild card in cities is drugs. I don't think anybody understood the impact of it and the enormity of the scale of destruction that it's wrought. I think fear is deadly to a city. I think once you have fear, if people have an option to move, they will move.
Since World War II, the city has lost more than 500,000 residents, most of them middle-class whites. Companies moved out just as quickly. In 1960, Philadelphia had 2/3 of the region's employment. That was before it lost 250,000 jobs. As more of the city's businesses and productive citizens abandoned the city, they fueled a vicious downward trend. To compensate for a declining tax base, the city raised taxes and lowered services, which drove away more businesses and middle-class residents. And when the middle class moved out, taking their jobs with them, what was left behind, in many cases, was the shell of a city.
This is the Wyneva Hotel. It was once an apartment building for middle-class people that, unfortunately, has been abandoned for 30 years. Since 1950, we've lost close to 30% of the population. So we have housing units that people don't seem to want or don't seem to need anymore, and this has really placed a terrible burden on the city. We believe there are about 22,000 vacant residential buildings in the city right now, and about 30,000 vacant lots that resulted from the demolition of vacant houses that couldn't be saved.
The white middle class also left behind the poor, African Americans, Hispanics, and recent immigrants. Today, 70% of the students in the Philadelphia school district come from poor families.
To be a child in this neighborhood, you know that safety is an issue, and so you're not playing out on the street on a regular basis. During the day, you might see, drug activity on a regular basis, walk by it, homelessness, there's shootings and gunshots are heard. All of those things become natural to children who live in this neighborhood. There's no basketball place to go play at. There are no trips or day camps and things that keep kids busy. So what happens, 7th and 8th graders get busy, and we know what that is. They either get busy by playing with each other, or they get busy by dealing drugs, or all those kind of things, because that's what's available to them.
Over a period of 250 years, a wonderful and efficient system of housing and employment for more than 2 million people evolved in Philadelphia. Center City, Philadelphia remains vibrant, but slowly, inexorably, the neighborhoods surrounding Center City began to die. And it wasn't just Philadelphia. Hundreds of American cities and towns have lost population since the 1950s, always accompanied by eroding neighborhoods and dilapidated buildings. In Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh lost nearly half its population. Scranton, Johnstown, Easton, Harrisburg, Chester, Williamsport, York, Altoona, and Reading all lost anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of their population. Meanwhile, the countryside surrounding these cities was experiencing a different kind of crisis.
When the 422 bypass was finished and the 202 around Norristown, Route Row and 100 was straightened out, development pressure started to get great in here.
For 5 generations, Horace Mowrer's family tilled the soil of northern Chester County, about 40 miles outside Philadelphia.
And my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father, and myself, and my son.
But in 1988, he sold his farm and moved west to Huntingdon County.
It was hard to leave, but it's a fact of life. If I wanted to farm, I was going to have to go farm somewhere else.
What happened to Horace Mowrer has been happening to farmers all over southeastern Pennsylvania. In the last 25 years, the area has lost 1/4 of its farmland, even as its population decreased by 150,000 residents. Statewide, Pennsylvania has lost 1 million acres of farmland in just the last 10 years. That's an area nearly the size of Delaware that will never be farmed again. About the time Horace Mowrer was selling his farm, I was chastising the Chester County Commissioners on the editorial pages of the Mercury for their failure to do anything about sprawling development. The urban megalopolis was surging down the Route 202 high-tech corridor from King of Prussia into the heart of the countryside. Strip malls and luxury-class Levitowns were elbowing into the Brandywine Valley from Delaware. scattered development was spattering from the new Route 422 expressway into northern townships.
It was like a wave. It really was a wave, and people were very concerned. People couldn't get out of their driveways. Farms were disappearing. Traffic was increasing. The vistas that people were used to were gone. People wanted development stopped. What they didn't understand was that local municipalities had control over land use. So we decided to tackle the problem with forming a task force made up of people that normally don't sit around the same table and discuss these issues. And from the task force, we came up with a countywide plan, which led to the recommendation of the $50 million bond issue.
Yeah, the bond, the 1989 bond issue essentially was money being provided to manage growth and to protect open space in Chester County. It turned out that a great deal of the open space that people really cared about was farms. The only way to save farmland in Pennsylvania is you either have to buy the farm and deed restrict it, persuade the farmer to give you the easement which provides you with the development rights in exchange for some tax benefits, or you pay them for the development rights.
Since the original bond issue was passed, Chester County has spent more than $100 million to preserve 15,000 acres of farmland and open space. But at the same time, the county lost even more land to development than it preserved. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania has established the second largest farmland preservation program in the nation. In the past 10 years, more than $280 million has been spent to buy development rights to farms. But in comparison to the amount of land we're losing, it's still only a drop in the bucket. So far, this program has protected barely 2% of Pennsylvania's farmland. Developments like this are cropping up all across Pennsylvania, displacing farmers and destroying beautiful scenery. With every passing decade, we've been consuming more and more land for each house, store, and office we build. With every decade, hundreds of thousands of acres of Pennsylvania countryside has been lost forever to strip malls, parking lots, and monotonous sprawl. And remember, at the same time, thousands of acres of formerly thriving neighborhoods in our cities have been neglected and abandoned. What happened to bring this lunacy about?
We're building these houses because these are the kind of houses that people want in today's marketplace. And in order to be a successful builder, we have to build what the people want.
What do suburban homeowners want?
Yeah, certainly where I grew up, we lived in a neighborhood where there was a community park, and that's where everybody congregated and the kids played. And
I could go down to the barber shop, and I would walk to the barber shop.
Yeah, I mean, we take the kids for a walk around the neighborhood, but there's literally, you cannot walk to anything as far as any stores or anything. I mean,
if you want to be with others, you generally have to drive somewhere.
It should be a 5-mile drive, but it's 20-minute drive,
20 minutes to 45
Fridays,
minutes, depending
30
on traffic.
minutes.
If I could change anything about this area, I would like to have stores that I could walk to, a grocery store, a pharmacy, something like that.
Perhaps a pizza shop, boutique shop.
A grocery store that you could go down to.
Or a place where you can just hang out, or for that matter, have a beer with somebody.
You don't have any of that today, and we don't even try to build that in.
I'd say if we had a little bit better sidewalks, if we had some at all, it would make it a lot easier to move around.
When I grew up, we had sidewalks, we had street lamps, and it would have been nice, not only safety-wise for the kids walking around, but gives you that more of the feel of a town rather than where you're just out here where it's so barren. You've got houses and you've got land.
I think that the only limitation without having sidewalks for the kids is that you really don't get to know the other kids in the neighborhood unless you're in the same school or the same class. And many of the kids in the neighborhood don't go to public school.
I'm a very accepting person of all incomes. I don't think you need to be a doctor or lawyer to live in a certain neighborhood. I think all jobs are equally important.
There are very few people of my age, for example.
Well, it's a shame they don't get to see more of the older generation, hear more about it. And it's just, again, one of the trade-offs.
Our big concern is the uncertainty of what's going to happen with a farm right next door. Because right now it's great because we live at a dead end, but if that ever gets developed, which it probably will, then it may not be as quiet a street anymore.
We can build developments that allow people to walk to work, to walk to shopping, and have a close relationship with nature as long as we can create zoning and planning that will allow it. Builders and developers are not in the business to fight the existing zoning laws. It takes too much time, too much effort, too much money, and so...
It turns out that it's not just the market, but regulations that shape our communities. The story of sprawl began in the 1930s. Times were hard. It was the Great Depression. In order to make it easier for Americans to buy homes, Franklin Roosevelt created the Federal Housing Administration. The FHA insured bank loans for homes, making it possible for the first time for citizens to buy a house with just 10% down. But there were a couple of rules. It had to be a nice home in a good neighborhood. The government defined that to mean things like a certain minimum setback from the street, no stores, just single-family houses, space between buildings, and new construction was favored over older houses. This meant that the house your parents and grandparents grew up in just wouldn't do. And if you happened to be black, forget about it. Naturally, this was disastrous for city neighborhoods. But in the boom years following the Second World War, it created thousands of acres of white middle-class suburbs on the fringe of every metropolitan area. In 1954, President Eisenhower appointed a commission to study the need for new highways. To head the committee, he appointed General Lucius Clay, a member of the board of General Motors. 2 years later, the Interstate Highway Act authorized 41,000 miles of new highways, with the federal government picking up 90% of the tab. Meanwhile, public transportation systems got no support and many went bankrupt. In the same way, the government subsidized new water and sewer systems in semi-rural areas and neglected urban infrastructure. To add insult to injury, the government built all its subsidized housing for the poor in the cities. Instead of encouraging diversified neighborhoods with equal opportunities for all, this concentrated poverty in inner city neighborhoods. Some of these projects have proved so unlivable that they've been abandoned. Here's an example of still another good idea gone awry.
In 1980, new federal environmental regulations made the owners of vacant industrial properties responsible to clean them up to almost pristine Garden of Eden standards before redeveloping them. As a result, it's far cheaper to build on farmland in the country than to reuse prime real estate in the city like this. Policies like this, once they're put in place, are really hard to change. In Pennsylvania, a lot of the bad planning of the past is effectively nailed in place by zoning laws. We're in Allegheny County here, where Pittsburgh is located. Allegheny County has 128 individual municipalities.
As in many other states, each local municipality does its own zoning with little or no cooperative planning or regional oversight. In Allegheny County, that means there must be zones to accommodate 128 strip malls, 128 corporate centers, 128 landfills, not to mention 128 of every kind of residential development, from apartments to resorts. So if Walmart wants to build a store right here in the middle of a farm field, and the municipality wants to say no, state law says this little municipality has to find some other spot to put it, even though there may be 6 other Walmarts within 20 miles. Thanks to this crazy quilt zoning system, suburban municipalities continue to attract development, while cities like Pittsburgh continue to lose it.
What all these policies add up to is a huge historic government subsidy for suburban living. It's no wonder Pennsylvania's countryside has gotten all built up and its city neighborhoods neglected. The real wonder, when you think about it, is that our cities have survived at all.
For a long time, I thought, that's just the way things have to be. Urban decay and suburban sprawl are a fact of life, the price of living in a modern society. But then, I had a revelation. I was traveling here in England the first time I'd ever been abroad. I'm wandering about London on my first day with my little flash map in hand, all excited about seeing the famous landmarks I had read about for years. I've rounded the Tower of London, and I'm heading back to my hotel, when suddenly it dawns on me. I have just seen practically the whole history of England, and it's only taken about an hour and a half, on foot. All these parks and landmarks, museums, theaters, train stations, are packed into an incredibly small area. So small, I can hardly believe it. And in the days that followed, I made another amazing discovery. Except in the commercial areas, London didn't feel the least bit crowded. Every day I sat down on this bench on the south side of the Thames. Keep in mind, this is a city of 7 million people in the height of the tourist season. In front of me is the most famous vista in England, and every time I come here, I've got the whole bench to myself. It occurs to me, you know, it's really easy to get around this place on foot, and when people are on foot, they really don't take up much space. Think about it. This is me walking. If you measure the space around me, it's about 4 square feet. Now here's my house back home in Pottstown. 2,500 square feet, actually larger than the average house currently built in America. There's my wife working in our yard. Our lot is 1/10 of an acre. That's just the right size to give us all the yard we want and no more than we can handle. Now what happens if we move to the suburbs? Well, first off, since we can't walk anywhere, we need 2 cars, one for my wife and one for me. Standing still, each car takes about 25 times more space than a human being. But put them in motion, and they are real land-eating machines. At 60 miles an hour, my car needs about 1,000 square feet of pavement. Either that or really expensive collision insurance. Of course, everywhere I go, I need a parking space at the other end. Office, grocery store, mall, the health club, since I'm not walking anymore. Experts estimate there are 6 to 7 parking spaces for each of the 130 million cars registered in America. That's a lot of pavement. Not to mention the ugly billboards advertisers have thrown up to catch my eye as I'm speeding by. I think you get the picture. Now, where am I? Can you find me? There I am, just a little dot surrounded by all that unnecessary grass and asphalt. If you look really, really closely, you can see that I'm studying my bank balance, trying to figure out where all my money went. Anyway, I'm in London thinking about all this, and I wonder, what do the British suburbs look like? What do they do with their subdivisions and strip malls? Lo and behold, there's another surprise. You get to the edge of the city, and it just stops. There are no strip malls, no endless line of car dealerships, no subdivisions called Country Creek or Pleasant Vista, just an honest-to-goodness country view. Keep in mind, England is only slightly bigger than Pennsylvania in land area, and it has 4 times as many people. Clearly, somebody did something right. And I discovered something else here. Remember Wyomissing, where I was born? Wyomissing has always been a model for me of the ideal community.
Well, it turns out Wyomissing was designed after this town, just 30 miles north of London, Letchworth Garden City. Back in the frontier days, when the U.S. government was giving away land in the West, it probably seemed to most Americans that we'd never run out of space. In England, by contrast, there hadn't been any free land for centuries. The cities were getting crowded and polluted, and there was no place to escape. In 1898, a visionary Englishman named Ebenezer Howard proposed dealing with this problem by building small satellite cities in the countryside called garden cities that would allow people to live and work in lush, leafy neighborhoods immediately surrounded by large areas of open space. Letchworth was the first garden city. Today, Letchworth has 33,000 residents and 14,000 jobs, plus schools, churches, and parks, all within walking distance of each other, and all surrounded by a permanently protected expanse of open country called a greenbelt, which residents are free to enjoy. The nearby garden city of Welland is designed around a green central square surrounded by shops and anchored by a large mall. On the inside, the mall looks like any American galleria, but shoppers can walk to this mall, and much of the parking is underground. The English have firmly embraced Ebenezer Howard's ideal of carefully planned towns. After the Second World War, instead of scattering development at random all over the countryside as we did, the English continued their tradition of building self-contained towns connected to larger cities by public transportation and surrounded by permanently protected open space. Historic cities, like Bath, have also been surrounded by greenbelts to keep them from sprawling into the countryside. Nearly 60% of all new housing built in England is built on recycled land, like this former industrial tract outside of London. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is England. America is the land of large lots and lavish lawns. And besides, we don't want government telling us where to live. But the fact is, until the 1950s, most Americans did live in cities and towns, in close-knit neighborhoods, like this one in Letchworth. It wasn't until big government came along, with everything from highway subsidies to zoning regulations, that sprawl became the law of the land. But now, there are actually places in America that have succeeded in changing such laws. This is the Willamette Valley, which stretches south of Portland, Oregon, one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the United States. I'm with Hector Macpherson, whose family has farmed this land since the 1920s.
We have what is the Peoria Road, which is a road that leads directly to Corvallis, about 6 or 7 miles away, and people were leaking out and buying small tracts of land along that. This was simply development right along the major road of that area. Mm-hmm. But then we also saw there were certain actual subdivisions way out beyond any possible city services that were moving in to take up the land and to move out not just one or two, but en masse. And, you know, this was the kind of thing that I feared. And there was no breaks. There was nothing in Lynn County that I could turn to help me. There was absolutely no planning or zoning, no construction controls, no anything in the county. So we were able to get a petition passed by the county commissioners to invite to appoint the first planning commission.
Macpherson served on that planning commission and a few years later won a seat in the state senate.
I did not go to the state with the idea that I was going to solve the Oregon problems in land use planning. I went with the idea that I wanted to do something significant, and when I got there I found that I knew more about land use planning than most of my contemporary senators and representatives. And so at that point, I decided it was time for me to put together legislation which would help cure the problems that I saw in Oregon.
Thanks to this legislation, 25 million acres of land in Oregon are now zoned exclusively for farming and forestry.
And the whole purpose of the land use planning that I believe in is to simply make the best choices. And that's what we're trying to do here, is to make the best choices. We have to allow room for people, but they can't just go anywhere in Oregon and expect to be able to buy a bare piece of land and build a house.
Oregon's main planning tool is the growth boundary. Cities and counties in Oregon work together to draw boundaries around their traditional cities and towns. They allow enough room for all foreseeable growth for 20 years. Then they say, that's it. We'll talk again in 10 years. Inside this line, development is given the red carpet treatment. Outside, it's heavily restricted. To see the impact this has had, compare Metro Portland with Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Portland has the same number of people, but living on half the land area.
We've achieved the livability, and that's a word I should get in here and emphasize. Livability is the key word in Oregon, and we want to have livability above all else. But I had, of course, a specific thing that I was trying to save farmland, and that came out very strongly in the legislation that we have.
The remarkable thing is, Oregon's land use law, initially designed to protect the countryside, has made Oregon cities among the healthiest in the nation.
Metro Portland is thriving. Instead of development continually pushing outward, eroding the economic base of the center, abandoned land in the city is being recycled. Instead of government pouring money into new highways to keep up with sprawl, it's invested in new light rail lines, which also helps keep the downtown from being clogged with cars. Living in the city doesn't have to mean townhouses and apartments. Most residents of Metro Portland live in single-family detached houses with private backyards. In the 25 years since Macpherson's bill has passed, residents and even developers have come to wholeheartedly support it. Oregonians prefer to live close to the outdoors and enjoy it whole, rather than carving it up for suburban sprawl.
Portland is proof that just because America has a lower population density than England doesn't mean we have to sprawl. After all, Oregon has twice the land area of Pennsylvania and only a quarter as many people. Clearly, sprawl is not the inevitable result of having lots of land. It's a result of bad planning. Still, this part of Metro Portland is no Garden City. It's not nearly as nice as Letchworth or Wyomissing. In fact, looks a little haphazard.
In fact, it is haphazard. In Portland, growth is contained, but not organized. It's still a hodgepodge rather than the carefully laid out mix of spaces that make Letchworth and Wyomissing so attractive. Portland drew a line around the outside, but there are a handful of places in the U.S. that are planning from the middle as well. This is Charlotte, North Carolina, another rapidly growing metropolitan area. David Walters, a professor at the University of North Carolina here, was asked by several towns in the Charlotte region, such as Davidson, how they could plan their growth to create real communities instead of sprawl. Walters is English, so he turned to England's garden cities for inspiration.
And we began by identifying the floodplains, the steep slopes, areas that you couldn't build, and then we moved on to choose areas of particular scenic beauty, along highways and so forth, that were particularly valued by the community and which they wanted to preserve. Then we linked these with greenways and parks and ball fields and made a series of green edges to neighborhoods so that the edges were defined by the natural landscape. Then what happened was that this map became the basis for the official zoning maps that the towns adopted, and the design standards in this design became integrated with the design standards in their zoning ordinances.
So far, 6 towns in the Charlotte area have adopted new zoning ordinances to promote the development of traditional neighborhoods. Residential areas have houses drawn close to the street and each other to give them a traditional feel. Abundant sidewalks lined with large shade trees encourage walking. Garages are placed behind the homes on alleys so you can see front porches instead of driveways.
The town center district encourages a mix of single-family detached houses, apartments, offices, and shops, so long as the buildings blend together. Parking lots are placed to the rear to maintain attractive streets and a pleasant environment for pedestrians.
Well, interestingly enough, one of the main catalysts in this whole process was a big residential developer here that at one of our countless public meetings, he stood up and said, now why don't you all just make a complete build-out plan for the whole community just like towns used to do? That way everybody will know what the rules are. See, one of his main fears as a developer trying to do high-quality development was that somebody would come in next door and just produce some banal mediocrity and undercut all his good efforts. So it was in his own economic self-interest to have a master plan that would embody the high standards that apply to everybody. And for complying with these standards, the developers are rewarded by incentive bonuses and the freedom to mix and match housing types, to be creative in their own development, to make the most of the market opportunities.
From a developer standpoint, you're not building one neighborhood that's burned up and potted over here from 150 to 180 and wondering if you can hit that price point. In other words, I can hit price points from 120s to 140s, 140s to 200s, 200s to 210s. One of the things from a developer standpoint makes it attractive is that in one neighborhood, you really have 5 or 6 combined. And you can also sell commercial property. We have our restaurant sites, our tavern sites, and we have several sites here to build little neighborhood office buildings. So I can be a commercial developer, a affordable housing developer, a high-end developer, all in one spot. It's really become more of a quest than building a development. It's really trying to build something that people can enjoy, that people can... I always look at it where people go on vacation, they go to places like Savannah or Charleston, they go for a walkable neighborhood, and my feeling is you can have that kind of neighborhood and live in it every day. You don't have to be a tourist going to these type of older neighborhoods that have survived.
In Celebration, Florida, we can see a town like this that is well underway. This town was made possible because Disney Development Corporation owned all the land and had a vision to design the ideal community of tomorrow. As it turned out, the ideal community of tomorrow looks an awful lot like the ideal town of yesterday.
My daily routine here in Celebration is the kids walk to school. We live about 5 houses down from the school. I walk on to work after school. My daughter walks over here to the store, hangs out with me for a couple of hours, and then we get to walk home together. We've done away with one of our cars, so we're a one-car family now.
And it's a great place for kids. We feel very safe here. We feel like the bigger kids are looking after them. We feel like the other adults around know them.
You can't walk to downtown without seeing someone that you know. You can't sit on your porch and have your cup of coffee without going, oh, there's so-and-so, wonder what they're working on. Hey, what are you working on over there? There's truly a sense of community, and it's a very comfortable sense of community.
The variety of homes available allows all the different individuals with different career patterns to pick a home that's best for them and their family members.
You meet people that you wouldn't in ordinary circumstances in life. You meet anybody who's in Celebration.
You have retirees, you have young families, you have double income, no children.
It's not, oh, this side of town has great big homes and this side has smaller homes. Nobody really looks at those things.
What my wife and I like to do on date nights, my mom will keep the kids for us, or we'll hire a babysitter. My wife and I will get on our bicycles, we'll ride down, park our bikes, go to the movie, then go to dinner, and come back home, and we don't even have to leave the community.
This is Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the richest farmland east of the Mississippi. For decades, traditional Amish and Mennonite farmers in Lancaster County have been getting pushed aside by development. At the same time, the city of Lancaster has been struggling to deal with the flight of wealth to the suburbs. Now, we've seen in Oregon how growth boundaries protect the countryside and revitalize towns. And we've seen in North Carolina how zoning laws can be changed to make it possible to build traditional communities once again. Why can't we apply these ideas here? Well,
Lancaster County has been trying to follow the model of places like Portland and Davidson. But as in other parts of the country, antiquated land use laws get in the way.
We have established urban growth boundaries to separate the areas of the county that are appropriate for development from those areas that are not.
Okay, so what do we need to make these growth boundaries in Lancaster County or anywhere else in America really effective?
To be really successful in Pennsylvania, there are three things that we need to do. First, we need to change the laws that govern planning and zoning and taxing in the state, because these laws, as they exist today, encourage sprawl. We need to change the law to give the power to counties and municipalities to plan on a regional basis and to enforce growth boundaries. Secondly, we need to build traditional communities like they're building in other states. And finally, number three, we need to encourage reinvestment in our existing cities and towns.
America has thousands of acres of land, strategically located, with needed infrastructure already in place, just waiting to be developed. It's all those abandoned factories and other vacant lands in our cities and towns. Hares Island, directly across the Allegheny River from downtown Pittsburgh, was for years derelict and polluted, the site of an abandoned meatpacking plant and scrapyard. Thanks to financing and tax incentives, it has been turned into a lovely residential and office development called Washington's Landing. The development is a leading example of Pennsylvania's land recycling program, which offers grants and loans to clean up and reuse vacant industrial sites. But it's hard to imagine a less likely place to build a neighborhood than 9 Mile Run, a polluted stream running through a gigantic slag dump along the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh. From the 1920s to the 1970s, dozens of trainloads of slag from nearby steel mills were dumped here every day, creating 250 acres of hideous moonscape. The same Pittsburgh architects who helped design Celebration, Florida, have finished plans to transform this dump into thriving neighborhoods.
Not only are we reclaiming a brownfield site in a city, but what we're putting in its place is a great American neighborhood. One of the great inventions we've had in our country is the neighborhood, the American neighborhood, which is front porches and back alleys and streets and neighborhood parks and neighborhood schools. Those are things that exist in the United States. And here we have the example of a brownfield reclamation and a great new traditional American neighborhood coming together in one place and celebrating our diversity by making sure that people of all incomes could live in this neighborhood. But the big idea is the park that's going to be created right down here, 9 Mile Run, which is now a polluted stream. It's going to be transformed with the most current techniques for transforming streams and cleaned with new wetlands will be created. The slopes themselves, which you see now are unforested, will be forested with new techniques. And so the front door, the address of this neighborhood, Somerset, will be the extended Frick Park that will take you all the way to the Mon River right there.
And we haven't even mentioned the environmental consequences of sprawl. Air pollution, groundwater contamination, even global warming.
The governor commissioned a study that worked for a year and produced a report that said, among other things, that suburban sprawl was the biggest threat to Pennsylvania's environment in the 21st century. The commission found that sprawl chews up farmland and open space, it destroys natural habitat for animals and plants, and it increases both air and groundwater pollution. Projects like 9 Mile Run are a big part of the solution to urban sprawl. They reuse land we've already developed, they clean up sites that are polluted, they reduce the pressure to develop farms and other open space, and they're good places to live.
There are reasons for optimism all across America. More than 20 states, from Maryland to Arizona, have begun efforts to curb sprawling development. Builders, environmentalists, and businessmen are finding common ground in a new concept called smart growth that concentrates development in and around existing towns and transportation corridors. Dozens of traditional neighborhoods, places like Celebration, are being built in rapidly growing areas like Florida and California. Elsewhere, they're being designed for vacant lands in existing cities and towns. And there's renewed interest in preserving the wonderful neighborhoods and main streets we already have. Public interest groups are also involved, And we'll list a few websites and phone numbers at the end of this program. But frankly, America will never save its cities, towns, and countryside as long as the dream home for most of us includes a half-acre lot in the countryside that's far from stores, schools, and jobs. Sure, sprawl seems natural to us because that's what we've known in our lifetimes. But in the whole sweep of recorded history, it's just been a couple of ticks on the clock. A recent experiment that's proving disastrous for America. Just look at where sprawl's brought us. We've neglected our cities and towns. We've turned beautiful landscapes into strip mall junkscapes. We've subdivided and paved over vast expanses of prime farmland. We've condemned ourselves to a wearisome life of constant driving. And perhaps worst of all, sprawl has helped to isolate us, black and white, rich and poor, and make us fearful of one another. That's no way to live, and it doesn't have to be that way. Going back thousands of years, from the days of the ancients to the medieval era, colonial times, right up to the 1950s here in America, the vast majority of people have lived in villages, in towns, in the neighborhoods of cities, because they make so much sense as a way of life. Sure, our cities and towns were far from perfect in the 1950s, but had we continued to invest in them instead of abandoning them, they could have become beautiful, convenient, and enriching places to live. And it's not too late. We still have the ability to rediscover and rebuild our wonderful cities and towns. Just down the street from my house here in Pottstown, for example, is a vacant factory site, a former pie manufacturing plant. Now let's think how we could reuse that site to make a great place to live. Some of the old buildings are definitely worth keeping. We could put shops on the first floor and offices upstairs. We don't want a place that only rich people can afford, and we certainly don't want another place where just poor people live. So we'll put in a mixture of large and small houses and attractive apartment buildings. Play space for the children is really important, so we'll put in lots of public greens and playgrounds, no more than a few blocks from every house. There's a lot of work in and right around Pottstown, so we won't need to drive long distances to work. Still, we'd like to be able to get to Philadelphia easily, so we're going to turn this former Pennsylvania Railroad line into a light rail line. In fact, there's already a plan in the works to do just that. We'll give our development a village feel by putting in front porches and sidewalks and street lamps and lots of shade trees. That'll make it safe and convenient for kids to walk to the nearby schools and for parents to walk to Pottstown's shopping district just a few blocks away. We'll get excess cars off the street by putting alleys and garages behind the houses. What else? Well, we like to feel as close to the countryside as we are to the downtown, so why don't we create a wide greenway along the Schuylkill River with biking and walking trails? As it happens, again, there's already a plan to make this area part of a greenway that stretches from Fairmont Park in Philadelphia, 35 miles downriver, to Pottsville, 50 miles upriver. This wouldn't be just another development. It would be a real neighborhood. And you know, every town has a site like our old pie factory, just waiting to be transformed. I love living in Pottstown. I like the sense of place. I like waking up in the morning to the chimes of the Trinity Church Carillon. And every walking errand takes me past someone I know or something I love. I grew up in a white world, but 27 years of living in an integrated neighborhood have taught me to respect blacks, Hispanics, and other people whose background and education are not the same as my own. I didn't move here because I'm big on peace and brotherhood. I moved here because I wanted to walk to work, and I like the architecture. But now that I do live among people of all ages, races, and incomes, I find I'm rather proud of it. That's what democracy is all about. That's what William Penn had in mind when he founded Pennsylvania. Sitting on the patio behind my home on a pleasant fall evening, looking over moonlit rooftops to the clock tower of Transfiguration Lutheran Church, which has been standing since the days of Abraham Lincoln, I feel a sense of kinship with my neighbors and the generations before me that have lived under its glow. If we want to encourage caring in America, I've come to believe we need places to care about.
Funding for this program was provided by the Heinz Endowments, Wyomissing Foundation, Chester County Community Foundation, Susquehanna Pfaltzgraff Company, Montgomery County Lands Trust, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. VHS copies of this program are available for $35.95 postpaid from Bullfrog Films. Call 1-800-543-FROG.